discussion, that the decline of productive capitalism, industrial capitalism in Europe and the United States doesn't necessarily mean that this form of capitalism has ceased to exist globally. I would say today that in a situation where China is the workshop of the world, where China is playing the role which more or less British capitalism did in the 19th and early 20th century, producing a large amount of goods that were bought or imposed on the rest of the world. The Chinese don't impose them. They just produce them so cheaply that they'll end up everywhere. There is nothing in most parts of the world. You walk into a market, you will not be able to find too many things that are not made in China. Which means that in China and in Vietnam to a certain extent, you have a form of capitalism which is not so new. It's very similar in some ways to what we have been through. Of course, there are differences as well, what we have been through in Europe. I give you, just to demonstrate this, an interesting anecdote. An old acquaintance of mine, professor of history at Cambridge, was invited by the Chinese Politburo's think tank to give a talk on Britain. He was a bit surprised, but he accepted. And he said, I would like to speak on this. And they said, no. We would like you to speak on just answering for us this question: how did Britain avoid a revolution in the 19th century? And he went and said, this is how. And they said, and there was no democracy in Britain in the 19th century? And he said, no. And they looked at each other and smiled. Now, the point they were making is that they realized that the productive forces in China are so explosive that the move from the countryside, where there have been even small peasant uprisings, into the towns out of desperation is so strong that you don't just have marginal populations in China, you have a huge industrial development of the new type since China became this power. So what you say, I think, is essentially applicable to Europe and possibly to most of North America. I don't think it applies as yet to China or to India or to Vietnam or even to South Korea or Taiwan, countries which, whatever their other flaws, and there are many, are not yet in that same situation. I don't think capitalism globally can do without some industrial base, simply in order to keep going. So what to do with the situation in Europe, that's a very important question. It's a question which capitalism cannot answer. And it is a question for which you need a new type of state, a new type of system, whatever you want to call it. Socialism, post-socialism, communism, whatever. But the capitalist state cannot deliver that. The danger in that, of course, politically speaking, is you have these crazy explosions like you're having in Europe, where they're targeting migrants, they're targeting Romani people, precisely because they cannot find any solution to their own problems at all. I mean, Sarkozy actually was one of the few presidents who boasted about deporting Romani people out of France. And they do it, and more politicians will do it, by saying this is the real problem, that is the danger. And arising also from what you said, in what I think does apply to a certain extent to Europe and America, is the question, if that is the case, and it probably is, what is the revolutionary subject today? Big question.